Welcome to the channel, friends. Today we will tell you about 10 absolutely forbidden American cars you have not seen such before. Not all American cars were created for Route 66. Some were too fast, too dangerous, or too weird to survive. These 12 absolutely forbidden cars were not just forgotten, they were practically erased from history. Some were banned for safety reasons, others because of emissions, and some were simply too crazy to exist on public roads. Let's look at 12 absolutely forbidden American cars. Before watching, support the channel by subscribing and liking. Do not forget to click the bell so as not to miss.
Number 10. 1970 AMC Rebel Machine. In the muscle car wars of the late 1960s and early 70s, every American manufacturer had its high-horsepower street machine. But when American Motors, a company better known for economy cars and conservative styling, dropped the 1970 AMC Rebel Machine, it was like a fist through a stained glass window. Loud, brash, and painted red, white, and blue, the machine wasn't just a car, it was a full-on protest against being overlooked. And yet, despite its raw power and rare charisma, it vanished almost as quickly as it arrived. Here's why the AMC Rebel Machine is one of the most ultra-banned muscle cars, not by law, but by time, culture, and industry silence. It looked like a factory joke, but it was dead serious. The Rebel Machine came stock with a patriotic paint job, literally. The base color was white, with bold red stripes and blue accents from the factory. Many thought it was a gimmick, but under the hood, a 390 cubic inch V8 pushing 340 horsepower and 430 pound-foot of torque. It was one of the fastest cars in America in 1970, with quarter-mile times rivaling the big names from Mopar and Ford. But here's the issue: most people didn't take it seriously. Car buyers looked at AMC and saw Hornets and Gremlins, not drag strip demons. Dealerships didn't know how to sell it. And the styling? A love-it-or-hate-it block of muscle and noise. A car out of step with its company and its time. AMC had no racing legacy to lean on like Dodge or Pontiac. The machine was an orphan, launched into a market that was already saturated and starting to shift. Insurance rates for muscle cars were skyrocketing, emissions regulations were closing in, and the public mood was changing from horsepower to practicality. AMC only built around 2,300 machines and just one model year. After that, the company returned to safer bets like the Matador and Ambassador. No fanfare, no follow-up. The machine was effectively banned by the market, by timing, and by AMC itself. Why it deserves respect today. The AMC Rebel Machine was a bold risk by a small company trying to punch above its weight. It wasn't perfect, but it was powerful, rare, and proudly different. In a sea of clones and badge swaps, the machine stood out with a voice all its own. Today, it's a collector's dream, not just because of what it was, but because of what it represented. A last stand of unfiltered American muscle before the oil crisis, regulations, and rising costs shut the party down. The Rebel Machine wasn't banned in the courts, it was banned by the times. But we remember. Number 9. 1966 Ford Fairlane GT 427. When people talk about Ford muscle cars, they usually mention Mustangs or Thunderbolts. But in 1966, Ford quietly unleashed a beast that never got the spotlight it deserved, the Ford Fairlane GT 427. It didn't roar onto billboards or dominate showrooms. It didn't even get mass production. But in the right hands, it was one of the most serious street-legal drag strip weapons Ford ever built. And it was never meant to be mainstream. Born for NHRA rules, not for the masses. The 1966 Fairlane GT was Ford's response to General Motors and Mopar dominating the drag strips. To qualify for NHRA Superstock competition, Ford had to build at least 50 examples of a street-legal Fairlane with the monstrous 427 cubic inch V8, the same engine used in the legendary Galaxy lightweights and Cobra race cars. It was a brute. Over 425 horsepower, solid lifter camshaft, dual carburetors on some versions, and a close ratio 4-speed manual. The car had reinforced suspension, heavy-duty drivetrain components, and even came with a fiberglass hood featuring a massive functional scoop. But Ford didn't advertise it. In fact, these cars were quietly sold through select dealers to racers, not to the general public. No fancy brochures, no TV spots, just a whisper among those who knew where to look. Why you rarely hear about it. Unlike the Mustang or the Torino Cobra, the Fairlane GT 427 wasn't mass-produced. Ford only made about 57 of them, depending on the source, and most were immediately modified, raced, or destroyed. These weren't cars meant for daily driving. They were barely streetable race machines with license plates. Because of that, they disappeared from the public eye almost as soon as they were born. Insurance companies hated them, emission standards were looming, and Ford knew this car wasn't sustainable. It was built for a purpose, not for profit. Today, the 1966 Fairlane 427 is a true unicorn. If you ever see one in person, you're looking at a piece of American racing history. It was part of Ford's war effort against Dodge and Chevy, an unfiltered, factory-built dragstrip assassin. It wasn't banned in the literal sense, but it was too raw, too focused, and too rare to survive the transition into the more regulated 1970s. In many ways, it was erased, not by failure, but by its own purpose-driven nature. This wasn't a car for everyone. It was for the few who could handle it.
Number 8. 1964 Ford Thunderbolt. This isn't your average vintage Ford. The 1964 Ford Fairlane Thunderbolt was never built for comfort, style, or daily commuting. It was designed for one thing only: winning at the drag strip. In the early 1960s, the big three automakers were in an arms race, not for horsepower on paper, but for domination on asphalt. NHRA drag racing was where reputations were made, and Ford was falling behind. That's when they built the Thunderbolt, a car so extreme, so specialized, that it came straight from the factory ready to race. Built to destroy Dodge and Chevrolet. The Thunderbolt started life as a basic Ford Fairlane, but it was radically re-engineered by Ford's Experimental Vehicles Garage and subcontracted to Dearborn Steel Tubing. Under the hood, the legendary 427 cubic-inch high-riser V8, a race engine pulled straight from Ford's NASCAR and drag programs. Rated at 425 horsepower, but everyone knew the real number was closer to 600. It had dual Holley 4-barrel carburetors, a massive cold air intake through the headlight holes, and a 4-speed manual or heavy-duty automatic transmission. It could run low 11s in the quarter mile right off the lot, a terrifying number in 1964. Lightweight and bare bones. To make the car faster, Ford stripped it down to the essentials. It had fiberglass fenders, hood and bumpers, plexiglass windows, and no radio, heater, or sound insulation. The battery was even relocated to the trunk for better weight distribution. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't quiet, but it was brutally effective. Only 100 units were built to meet NHRA Superstock rules. Ford made 41 automatics and 59 four-speeds, and all were essentially hand-built race cars with a VIN. Not street-friendly, but street-legal. Technically, the Thunderbolt was street-legal. You could register it and drive it on public roads. But it was never really meant to be. The cold air intake made it struggle in the rain, the carb setup was finicky, and the lightweight parts made it fragile for anything but straight-line speed. Most Thunderbolts went straight into the hands of professional drag racers who tuned and campaigned them under Ford's Total Performance marketing banner. And they dominated. The Thunderbolt helped Ford win the 1964 NHRA Manufacturers' Cup, proving it was a true race weapon, not a gimmick. Today, the 1964 Thunderbolt is considered one of the most extreme factory muscle cars ever made.
With its low production numbers, unmatched performance, and racing pedigree, surviving examples are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. It wasn't banned, it wasn't recalled, but it was simply too wild for the world to keep around. The Thunderbolt didn't just push the envelope, it tore it in half.
Number 7. 1971 Chevrolet Vega Cosworth prototype. In the early 1970s, Chevrolet saw the writing on the wall. Muscle cars were under threat from rising insurance rates, emissions regulations, and gas prices. The future wasn't in big V8s anymore. It was in lightweight, high-revving, efficient performance cars. That's where the Chevrolet Vega Cosworth prototype comes in. It was supposed to be America's answer to the best of Europe, a blend of Chevrolet practicality and racing technology from the UK. It looked like a Vega, but what was under the hood told a very different story. A collaboration with Cosworth. Chevrolet partnered with Cosworth Engineering, a British company renowned for its success in Formula One. Their mission? Turn the Vega into a high-revving street machine that could go toe-to-toe with imports like the BMW 2002 and Alfa Romeo GTV. The prototype engine was based on Chevy's new 2.0-liter aluminum inline-4, but Cosworth transformed it. It got dual overhead camshafts, forged pistons, solid lifters, and most notably, fuel injection, at a time when American cars were still dominated by carburetors. Output was a claimed 170 horsepower, impressive for a subcompact in 1971, and more than enough to make the lightweight Vega genuinely quick. A true driver's car in the making. This prototype wasn't just about straight-line performance. Chevrolet planned to give it a close ratio 5-speed manual, sports suspension, and upgraded brakes. It was going to be nimble, responsive, and fun, tailored to enthusiasts who cared about driving, not just muscle. Interior features were expected to be upscale for a Vega, with special badging, a unique dash, and likely Recaro-style seats. It was intended to be affordable, efficient, and thrilling, a true departure from traditional American performance cars. So, what went wrong? Despite promising early testing, the 1971 Cosworth Vega prototype never made it to production. GM engineers struggled to meet new federal emission standards, and the high price of hand-assembling the engine with Cosworth parts made it a tough sell. By the time Chevrolet figured out how to make it street legal, it was 1975, and the world had changed. The eventual Cosworth Vega production car did launch in 1975, but by then it was heavier, restricted to 110 horsepower, and far more muted than the raw prototype envisioned in 1971. The dream of a nimble, world-beating American sport compact had faded. The original 1971 Chevrolet Vega Cosworth prototype remains a fascinating glimpse into what could have been. It was a rare moment when Chevrolet looked forward, toward European-style precision and technology rather than brute force. Though it never made production, it laid the groundwork for future American compact performance cars. It also showed that GM was capable of thinking differently, even if the realities of regulation and production ultimately got in the way. In many ways, the 1970s.
Number 6. 1987 Buick GNX. The car GM was almost too afraid to build. In the late 1980s, the American muscle car was nearly dead. Emissions regulations, insurance rates, and fuel economy standards had tamed most V8s into shadows of their former selves. But in 1987, Buick, a brand known more for quiet comfort than high performance, shocked the world with one final act of rebellion. That act was the GNX, the Grand National to the extreme. Built for just one model year, only 547 units were produced. But what it did in that short time became legend. Turbocharged power, and then some. At its heart was a 3.8-liter V6 with a turbocharger and intercooler. But the GNX wasn't just a warmed-up Grand National. It was re-engineered with the help of ASC/McLaren, the same company that worked on Indy cars and exotic prototypes. The result? A conservatively rated 276 horsepower and 360 pound-foot of torque, though real-world dyno numbers suggest it was even higher. Buick was cautious, but performance wasn't. The GNX could run the quarter mile than the low 13-second range, quicker than a Ferrari 328 or Porsche 911 of the time. In fact, it was the quickest production car in America in 1987, period. Blackout appearance, serious attitude. The GNX looked like a villain. Dressed in all black, with black wheels, fender flares, functional vents, and a menacing stance, it didn't wear chrome. It didn't want to look classy, it wanted to scare you. Inside, it retained the Grand National's basic layout, but featured a numbered plaque, Stewart Warner gauges, and a sense that you were driving something special, something serious. The GNX wasn't just fast, it was symbolic. It was a last hurrah. Rear-wheel drive muscle was disappearing. Buick knew this car didn't fit the times, and that's what made it so special. The GNX was the final punch before GM shifted to front-wheel drive luxury sedans and SUVs. It proved that even in the era of downsizing and restraint, American performance wasn't dead, it had just evolved. And it could still terrify anything from Europe or Japan that dared to line up next to it. A collector's dream. Today, the 1987 GNX is a blue-chip collectible. With ultra-low production numbers, true racing pedigree, and raw performance, it's one of the most desirable American cars of the 1980s. It wasn't built for everyone, it wasn't built for long. But for one perfect moment, the GNX showed the world what Buick and Detroit was still capable of.
Number 5. 1971 Pontiac GTO Judge. By 1971, the American muscle car era was beginning to fade. Insurance premiums were rising, federal emissions standards were tightening, and gasoline prices were creeping upward. But even as the storm clouds gathered, Pontiac gave the world one last thunderclap, the 1971 GTO Judge. This wasn't just a car, it was a statement, bold, defiant, and loud, right down to the name. Born in 1969 as a street-fighting, budget-friendly performance package, the Judge had always been more than just a trim level. It was Pontiac's muscle flagship, and in '71, it went out swinging. Still powerful, but now fighting back regulations. Under the hood of the 1971 GTO Judge sat the legendary 455 HO V8, pumping out a factory-rated 335 horsepower and a massive 480 pound-foot of torque. But new lower compression ratios and net horsepower ratings signaled a change in the times. Though down on paper compared to earlier years, real-world performance was still blistering. The Judge could run the quarter mile in the low 14s, making it one of the fastest full-size muscle cars still standing in '71. It also came with performance-tuned suspension, a functional ram air hood, and the unmistakable Judge decals. This was no sleeper. Design evolution and the beginning of the end. For 1971, the GTO featured a more sculpted look with a revised front end, recessed grille, and cleaner lines. While still aggressive, it was more mature, less wild teenager, more seasoned street warrior. Unfortunately, times had changed. Sales of the GTO Judge plummeted in 1971. Only 374 Judges were produced that year, and just 17 of them were convertibles. That made it the rarest production year of any Judge, and effectively, the final one. Pontiac officially retired the Judge after 1971, closing the chapter on one of the most iconic nameplates in muscle car history. A car that deserves respect. The 1971 Judge isn't just another muscle car, it's a symbol of resistance. It stood tall in a changing world, fighting to keep performance and style alive in the face of increasing regulation and shifting market tastes. Today, it's a highly prized collector car, especially because of its rarity and role as the Judge's swan song. It's also a reminder that even as the muscle era began to fade, Detroit could still build cars that stirred the soul. The 1971 GTO Judge didn't go quietly, it went with a roar. Number 4. 1973 AMC Gremlin V8.
the subcompact that refused to play small. When you hear the name Gremlin, you probably don't think muscle car. After all, it was AMC's answer to the fuel crisis, the import invasion, and America's growing appetite for smaller, more efficient cars. But in 1973, AMC did something no one expected. They shoved a 304 cubic inch V8 into this quirky little car and created one of the most bizarre yet oddly lovable American compacts ever made. Small body, big heart. The 1973 AMC Gremlin could be had with a 304 V8 producing around 150 horsepower. That may not sound like much today, but in a car that weighed just over 3,000 pounds, it made a real difference. With optional floor-shifted 3-speed manual or torque-flight automatic, the V8 Gremlin could chirp tires, surprise Mustangs off the line, and hold its own in the stoplight wars of the early 70s. It wasn't just about straight-line speed. The Gremlin handled reasonably well thanks to its short wheelbase and rear-wheel drive layout. And because AMC offered it at a low price, it became a working-class performance sleeper, the kind of car you didn't see coming. Unique design, polarizing style. The Gremlin's design is still debated to this day. With its long nose and chopped-off rear hatch, it looked like a car AMC forgot to finish. But that distinct profile was no accident. Designer Richard Teague deliberately shaped it from a shortened Hornet platform to create America's first true subcompact. Whether you loved it or hated it, the Gremlin got attention. And the V8 version? It made people stop laughing. The Gremlin's place in muscle history. By 1973, the muscle car era was already winding down. Emissions controls, rising insurance costs, and fuel economy concerns were choking off big engines. Yet AMC, never one to follow the crowd, gave the Gremlin a V8 anyway. Was it refined? Not at all. Was it ridiculous? A little. But was it fun? Absolutely. Today, the 1973 Gremlin V8 is a curiosity, a cult favorite, and a conversation starter. It wasn't meant to be a legend. It just happened to be weird, affordable, and kinda fast, all at the same time. In a decade filled with shrinking engines and rising regulations, the Gremlin V8 stands out as a last gasp of old-school American rebellion, squeezed into a compact body with a big attitude. Number 3. 1989 Pontiac Turbo Trans Am 20th Anniversary Edition. In the world of muscle cars, the late 1980s were a strange time. Emissions rules had gutted horsepower. The Mustang GT and IROC Z were shadows of their former selves. But in 1989, Pontiac quietly dropped a bombshell. To celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Trans Am, they built something so fast, so sophisticated, and so underappreciated, it shocked even the skeptics. This was the 1989 Turbo Trans Am, also known as the TTA, and it might be the most underrated performance car of its decade. Not just a V8, this one went turbo. Here's the twist. The 20th anniversary Trans Am didn't come with a traditional big V8. Instead, it borrowed the 3.8-liter turbocharged V6 from the Buick Grand National GNX, one of the fastest cars of the 1980s. But Pontiac didn't just copy and paste. They upgraded the heads and used the more efficient intercooled Garrett T3 turbo. Officially rated at 250 horsepower and 340 pound-feet of torque, real-world tests suggested those numbers were extremely conservative. Performance that left legends in the dust. The TTA was a sleeper with wings. It could do 0 to 60 in 4.6 seconds and run the quarter mile in 13.4 seconds, bone stock. That made it one of the fastest American production cars of the entire decade. And here's the kicker. It paced the 1989 Indianapolis 500 completely stock. No upgrades, no modifications, just the same turbo V6 and 4-speed automatic you could buy at the dealership. That's how good it was. Built in secret, disappeared in silence. Only 1,555 units were made. All were white with tan leather interiors and special badging. No flashy body kits, no wide fenders, just a clean third-gen Firebird look with subtle tweaks. And then, Pontiac quietly moved on. No major fanfare, no mass production, and no real follow-up. It was here, it was gone, and most people never even knew it existed. Today, the 1989 Turbo Trans Am is a collector's secret. It's faster than it looks, rarer than you think, and historically important. It was Pontiac's fastest car until the LS-powered GTOs of the 2000s, and it did it all with a V6 and a turbo. It's not just a special edition. It's a symbol of what Pontiac and GM could do when they decided to break the rules.
Number 2. 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440. When you think of Mopar muscle, cars like the Charger, Super Bee, or Cuda come to mind. But in 1968, Dodge did something wild. They took their small and unassuming compact car, the Dodge Dart, and dropped a full-blown 440 cubic inch big block V8 under the hood. What resulted wasn't just fast, it was downright intimidating. This is the story of the 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440, a factory hot rod so extreme it almost felt illegal. From grocery getter to giant killer. The Dodge Dart started life in the early 60s as a practical compact. But by the time 1968 rolled around, Dodge was fully committed to the muscle car wars. They already had the GTS version of the Dart, which came with 340 or 383 engines. But for a few lucky buyers, mostly drag racers, Dodge took it a step further. They installed the massive 440 Magnum V8 lifted straight from the Charger RT. That engine made 375 horsepower and a mountain of torque, all crammed into a lightweight compact car. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. The Dart 440 wasn't just about street cred, it was built with racing in mind. In fact, it wasn't a regular production model. Dodge produced around 50 Dart GTS 440s as special factory drag cars through the Dodge Scat Pack program, often in collaboration with Hurst Performance. These cars were stripped down, brutally fast, and offered very little in the way of creature comforts. They were purpose-built for NHRA Superstock competition, and they delivered. There were no wild graphics or giant spoilers. From the outside, the Dart GTS 440 looked like a normal compact until you heard it. With a big block rumble and quarter-mile times in the mid-12s, it embarrassed much pricier muscle cars. And thanks to its relatively lightweight and short wheelbase, it launched hard, sometimes too hard for street tires to handle. Driving one was an exercise in restraint and bravery. Why you've probably never seen one. Only a handful were made. These weren't mass-market vehicles, they weren't even advertised. Most people never knew they existed unless they were inside the drag racing scene. Today, they're incredibly rare and extremely valuable. They're part of Mopar legend, proof that Dodge would do whatever it took to win, even if it meant building a car that wasn't street-friendly or even entirely street-legal.
Number 1. 1970 Plymouth GTX 440+6. In the heat of Detroit's horsepower wars, the 1970 Plymouth GTX carved out a special place for itself. It wasn't just fast, it was refined, aggressive, and brutally capable. If the Roadrunner was for the budget-conscious street racer, the GTX was its older, meaner, more polished brother. And when fitted with the legendary 440+6 engine, it became one of the most fearsome Mopars ever built. Let's take a deep look at why the 1970 GTX 440+6 still commands respect and why so few muscle cars could stand in its way. Built for power, but with class. The GTX had been around since 1967, but by 1970, it reached its final and arguably most aggressive evolution. Built on the B-body platform, the car had sleek Coke bottle lines, bold hood scoops, and enough chrome to remind you this was still a high-end car. But under that hood, things got very serious. The 440+6, also known as the 446 barrel, was a 440 cubic inch Super Commando V8 with 3 2-barrel Holley carburetors. It was rated at 390 horsepower, but like most Mopars of the era, that number was conservative. Real output? Closer to 420-430 horsepower. A beast on the street and strip. That 440+6 setup gave it monster mid-range torque and a razor-sharp throttle response. Unlike the Hemi, which needed to rev, the 6-barrel setup provided explosive acceleration right off the line. Backed by a heavy-duty 727 torque flight automatic or a 4-speed manual, the GTX could run the quarter mile in the low 13s and even into the 12s with minor tweaks. That was serious performance for 1970, enough to outpace many Hemi cars in real-world drag scenarios, thanks to better drivability and less temperamental tuning. More than just muscle. The GTX wasn't just about brute force. It came with standard features like power front disc brakes, heavy-duty suspension, and a refined interior with wood-grain trim, bucket seats, and high-end trim pieces. This wasn't a stripped-out street brawler, it was a full-size performance machine with real comfort. But don't let the luxury fool you. This car was loud, aggressive, and capable of shredding tires with the tap of a toe. 1970 was the last year the GTX stood out as its own model before becoming a Roadrunner trim in '71. Emissions regulations, rising insurance premiums, and the oil crisis were about to choke the muscle car era. And that makes the 1970 GTX 440+6 one of the last true fire-breathing machines to roll out of Chrysler's golden age.